Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Philippe. I'm a research fellow with the Harvard Kennedy School and also an associate fellow with the FRS, Fondation pour la Recherche, Stratégique. I'm delighted to be your moderator today, and the program is going to be on the Indo-Pacific, as you know, and but with a different, perhaps, set of ideas. It's going to be a dialogue between a Japanese expert and a French expert. As you know, in just a few years, the concept of Indo-Pacific has become part of the geopolitical landscape, with dozens of countries using it as part of their defense, security, or even diplomatic strategies. No less than 8 countries have offered their Indo-Pacific strategies, the most comprehensive one being the American one. What's interesting in the recent move by the European nations is that they might be working together on the Indo-Pacific, and we'll hear about that later. Among Europeans, of course, France's Indo-Pacific strategy is the most advanced. It is based on a large territory, an extensive, exclusive economic zone, and a 1.6 million population. It maintains 7,000 troops in the region, based through Djibouti and other naval bases. And recently it sent a nuclear submarine, Emeraude, and a naval support ship, Sen, through the South China Sea. We'll hear about that in a minute. As far as Japan is concerned, it's of course a prime member of the Indo-Pacific region and has been a top promoter of a free and open Indo-Pacific since 2016. Japan, as one of the oldest maritime nations in the region, plays a major role alongside Australia, India, and the United States in preserving peace, stability, and freedom of navigation in both the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Through the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, Japan is in direct interaction with the governments of Australia, India, and the US, which involves major operational cooperations. But I won't go into more details. Today we have 2 excellent speakers to discuss this subject. And please ask your questions in the chat so that I can read them to the speakers. We only have about an hour, so time will go fast. And let me introduce briefly our 2 speakers. First, Dr. Yuichi Hosoya, who is Professor of International Relations, International Politics at Keio University in Tokyo. I'm sorry. In addition, he holds several other appointments, including Managing Director at the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Tokyo. And Professor Hosoya was also a member of the Prime Minister's Advisory Panel on National Security and Defense Capabilities. His recent books include Security Politics, Legislation for a New Security Environment, and more recently, a book he co-edited, History, Memory, and Politics in Post-War Japan. Dr. Valérie Niquet is a Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Asia Program at the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique in Paris. She has been a scholar of Japan and China for many years in different institutions, with a strong focus on security and foreign policy, and has been teaching at the Collège Interarmées. Her most recent books are Le Japon en 100 questions in 2020 and La puissance chinoise en 100 questions, so many questions, in 2017. So hopefully we'll have answers as much as questions today. And I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Hosoya first, and then to Valérie Niquet. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Philippe, for your very kind introduction. I'm Yuichi Hosoya. I'm a professor of international politics at Keio University. And today I will talk about Japanese conception of the Indo-Pacific strategy, or we usually call it as a free and open Indo-Pacific vision, namely the FOIP. And I will focus on the FOIP, how Japan has been thinking about this and why it is important for us to think about this concept. Actually, I spent 1 year, nearly a decade ago at Sciences Po Paris as a visiting professor, but my French actually wasn't improved. My English is also sometimes very unclear, but I hope that you can understand my English today. Basically, I will talk about 4 important points. In the beginning, I will talk on the importance and value of this concept of the Indo-Pacific, or the importance of the Indo-Pacific region. And then I will talk about the origins and the evolution of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. I will talk about why Japanese government has been sticking to this concept, or why Japanese government is trying to promote this concept to the world. And then thirdly, I will also talk about the aim and the essence of Japan's FOIP vision, because there are several different kinds of FOIP, like American FOIP, and of course, German FOIP and French FOIP. Our French Indo-Pacific strategy is also very important to be considered. So I will focus on Japanese version or vision of free and open Indo-Pacific. And then I will, in the end, talk about the place of Japanese strategy within a much wider international or global context. So let me talk about the importance and value of this vision first. Of course, Indo-Pacific is important because 3 biggest economies in the world nowadays, the United States, China, and Japan, are located in this region. And in addition to these, of course, this region is now the most dynamic region in the world for the economic growth. So we all can benefit from this rapidly growing economy or region here in the Indo-Pacific. So that's why I think that every major powers, leading powers, are interested in joining in this region or trying to shape the future of this region. And in addition to that, the other reason why this is important to consider the Indo-Pacific is that East Asia will enter into aging society. Of course, Japan is a rapidly aging society, but Korea and China will soon become much faster, much more rapidly growing aging societies. So that's why the market will be shrinked with the decrease or reduction of populations in these countries. Of course, we have technologies and we have financial resources. That's why we now need to use these financial resources, not just Japan, but of course, China or Korea and ASEAN countries as well. These countries should currently use our financial resources, our technology to help and support the economic growth of East Africa or South Asia, because East Africa and South Asia will soon become the most populous region in the world. It means that we will see rapidly growing economies or markets there, I mean, South Asia and East Africa. This is partly why former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe launched this regional concept or strategic concept in Nairobi in Kenya, because of course, East Africa should be the center of the next economic growth. And we need to link Japanese economy to these rapidly growing markets of East Africa and South Asia. So the concept is basically quite economic concept, economic strategy to continue our economic growth. Nearly 2 decades ago, Japanese government was really keen on trying to help surrounding countries, of course, ASEAN or Hong Kong, Taiwan, or Korea, China as well, to be richer, to be more prosperous. This is partly why Japanese government was making a great effort to invite China into the WTO in the middle of the 1990s. And Japan was the first country to lift the economic sanction against China soon after the Tiananmen Square incident of 1989. So at that time, Japan was repeatedly, I remember that Japan was repeatedly criticized as a quite soft on China. And Japan was repeatedly criticized that Japan was prioritizing our own economic interest at the cost of important human rights issues and so on. So that's why the world has changed. Nowadays, Japan was often regarded as quite hawkish country towards China. But in essence, I think that the Japanese diplomatic strategy has been driven by our economic calculation, how to maintain our economic interest or national interest by linking our economy with surrounding countries. So this is a basic, I think, importance of the strategy. First, the importance of linking East Asia or the Asia-Pacific with Indian Ocean rim countries. This is one thing. The other thing is that by linking these economies, we can maintain our current economic growth. So that's why one of the three pillars of Japan's FOIP is connectivity. And exactly this is why the EU has adopted EU's own Asian connectivity strategies. EU is also trying to connect European market with these rapidly growing markets or economies. So this is an important point which I want to stress upon, because American FOIP strategy is much more military oriented. And in that point, I think that American strategy is different from Japanese strategy. But we need the both, because without considering the balance of power in the world, without considering the security issues, we cannot really think about our economic interests, because the two things are combined much more closely than before. We usually use the word geo-economic or economic statecraft and so on to think about these combination of security interest and economic interest. And then I want to talk a little bit about the origins and the evolution of Japan's FOIP. The beginning was 2006, November 2006, when Japanese foreign minister at the time, Taro Aso, the later prime minister, but at the time foreign minister Aso Taro talked about the arc of freedom and prosperity. He focused on the importance of freedom, because we need to stick to the importance of freedom when we think about the future of this regional order. By launching this strategic concept, I think that this perhaps was perhaps the first Japanese diplomatic strategy since the end of the Cold War, which has a global vision in its nature. But on the other hand, the strategy was not strongly supported by key figures within Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan, because the concept of arc of free and prosperity was regarded at that time as encirclement of China. At that time, Sino-Japanese relationship was much better, and the economic relationship between the two countries were really important. That's why there are some people who didn't like the concept. So soon after that, Japanese government abandoned to use the word, the arc of freedom and prosperity. And this concept was usually remembered as first Abe's administration concept, because the succeeding prime ministers actually didn't really use the word, the arc of freedom and prosperity. And then Prime Minister Abe revived that idea in December 2012, when he became prime minister for the second time. And then he trying to focus on the importance of Quad. By launching a Quad is quadrilateral cooperation among four biggest democracies in the region: United States, Japan, India, and Australia. Prime Minister Abe wanted to promote the strategy by naming it as Asian Democratic Security Diamond. It's like a diamond by having four corners. But once again, Japan or Prime Minister Abe abandoned to use this concept, because once again, this concept was regarded as China's containment strategy. Since 2014, Japanese government made a great effort to try to ameliorate the Sino-Japanese relationship. And then the main focus was how to create much better Sino-Japanese relations. Of course, Japan has a huge interest in having a good relationship, friendly relationship with China. That's why Prime Minister Abe seemingly modified the strategy. And that previous strategy of the FOIP or Quad I usually call it as FOIP 1.0 because soon after that, Prime Minister Abe changed his mind to create a different kind of strategy. It would be much more inclusive. It can include both China and Russia. So the current Japan's FOIP strategy is basically quite inclusive, excluding no country from the concept. But on the other hand, of course, the United States is still sticking to the importance of quadrilateral security concept. That's why it's interesting to know that the Chinese government actually favors Japanese approach to the FOIP 2. American approach, because Chinese government nowadays understands that Japan has no strong intention to exclude China from the concept. But on the other hand, China has launched a different kind of regional vision. In 2014, at the Shika summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping actually proposed Asian security by the Asians. He focus on the importance of excluding external powers such as the United States, Australia, according to Chinese definition, and of course, France and the UK, and so Germany, and so on. So according to Chinese regional conceptions, those white countries, more or less, or those external powers, according to China, should not join in creating regional security order. So Japanese vision is quite different from Chinese order by not excluding any country. This is partly why I think the French government comes closer to Japanese concept by launching French own vision of Indo-Pacific strategy. So this is the aim of my third point, aim and the essence of Japan's FOIP. Basically, Japan's FOIP is quite inclusive, excluding no country. And that's partly why 1.5 years before, when I attended the Valdai conference in Sochi in Russia, I personally and I asked this question to President Putin. Why Russia doesn't have Russian version of Indo-Pacific strategy? Because every major leading country, powers in the world nowadays has its own version of Indo-Pacific strategy. As long as Russia is Pacific power, I recommend him to have Russian version of Indo-Pacific strategy. And he didn't actually criticize nor deny that. It's really rare that the Russian leader actually didn't deny or reject the idea, because Russian leaders basically thought that this is an encirclement and the containment of Russia, but it's not the case. Because as I said, the Japanese strategy is much more inclusive. So that's why Japan really welcomed French participation in the region, and of course, UK participation, or German participation, Dutch participation in the region. But on the other hand, China doesn't like it, because China wants to have much more exclusive Asian security order. And in the end, I want to end my talk by putting this in a much broader context. This concept must be open, because before 1945, Japan really tried to create exclusive regional order by launching East Asian prosperity sphere, and Japan failed. Japan failed to exclude external powers such as United States, France, or UK. And then after 1945, Japanese people rethink own national identity. We have to be international state, international power, or global power by trying to open up this region. And we shouldn't create any exclusive region. But interestingly, China is nowadays doing exactly what we did in the 1930s. So that's why, as a historian, I would say that China will fail in trying to exclude external powers from its own vision of East Asian security order. And I will stop here. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hosoya. And I think, you've set the ground for, what's happening on the other side of the Eurasia. And I'd like to know more about the European vision, but particularly the French vision of the Indo-Pacific. So Valérie, Niquet, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Professor Hosoya for his very brilliant, very broad and fascinating presentation of the concept of Freud, not only today, but with the historical perspective, and particularly the link you make with many historians have been working on this, on the relation between what is going on in China today and what was the status of Japan in the 1930s. And it's a very good point you've been making. So I will focus on the European side, even though I'm much more a specialist of Asia than of Europe. But I will focus maybe first, I would like to tackle about the differences between the German and the French Indo-Pacific strategy or document or position, because they are extremely telling about what the EU could do in the future, but also about the limits of cooperation in Europe or debate in Europe about what an Indo-Pacific strategy can be, because there are important differences that must be taken into account. The German, so I will start with the German document. The German document is and then at the end, just to finish my presentation, I will just mention very briefly that concept of strategic autonomy that is not always very well understood in Asia, of course, but also in some countries in Europe in relation with NATO and the United States. First, the context, is more broadly the evolution of the European Union position regarding China, in spite of some more recent evolutions, but Philippe knows very well because he wrote many things about it, like the recent Keio agreement between China and the EU. But in spite of that, Indo-Pacific and Asia strategy or vision at the EU level has changed a lot in recent years, and that must not be, it must be taken into account, these important changes of perception. There is no need to elaborate too much, but a major advance has been the 2019 EU-China strategic outlook that qualified the EU, China for the EU as a systemic rival. And China, of course, is very upset about that qualification, and since then has been trying to change it or to find a way to get the EU to change that qualification, because it is putting really the stress on the problematic relations we have with China, in spite, of course, of common interest in some areas. But even before 2019, even before that, China had been, before that, qualified as a source of instability, with a spilling off effect of destabilization up to the EU, a source of instability as much as a source of opportunities. And that also was also very new, because until quite recently, China was almost constantly presented at the EU level as also a source of economic opportunities. So this is a debate Japan has or had, and this is a debate that is also very important at the EU level. So just to sum up, the most important factor about thinking about these things is, of course, China, but it also, the importance of China, the centrality of China, actually, that cannot be avoided. It also explains the differences in attitude in different countries in Europe regarding the Indo-Pacific, in relation with the kind of relationship they established with China, and this hence the differences between the German and the French Indo-Pacific strategy. In Germany, the title of the document is Germany, Europe, Asia, Shaping the 21st Century Together. The stress is on cooperation and inclusivity. The stress is also much more on the economy and the rise of Asia as an economic power that Germany and Europe must take into account. Germany, in that context, defines itself as, I quote, an internationally active, it comes first, internationally active trading nation and proponent of a rules-based international order. So you see that the priorities for Germany is stability, but also very much related to the very important role, of course, that Germany is playing in terms of economic partners to Asia, but also to China. So this, of course, poses at the same time the scope of German interest in Asia, but in the Indo-Pacific, but also the limits of what it can do. The stress in that document is on 3 points: peace and security, and being against hegemony and bipolar structure. And so peace and security, it's once again, it's interesting. Nuclear power and nuclear threat comes first in the German document. And you see the list of all the nuclear power directly involved in the region, like China, India, Pakistan, but also Russia, the US, the UK, France, almost at the same level. So it's very interesting. This is the nuclear power per se. And this is sometimes something you can find in Japan too, or in other countries, that constitutes a threat to peace and security. You have also in that document the mention of disputed boundaries, refugee crisis, terrorism, internal tensions, but not mentioned specifically of a China threat or destabilizing factor. There is also in the document the necessity to diversify relations. Of course, one supposes, but it's not clearly said, beyond China, with democracies and partners, with shared values in the region, and of course with Japan. There is also in the document a mention of not accepting hegemony and bipolar structure, with something which to my view is extremely telling. It says no country in the document should be forced to choose between two sides as in the time of the Cold War. And this is in a way an issue. Of course, nobody wants to choose, and many countries in Asia do not want to choose between China and the US. But is it possible to stay in the middle and not to choose between a country that is, and Japan knows that very well, but also country in the South China Sea, for instance, a country, China, that is profoundly destabilizing because of the nature of its political regime, that needs a kind of nationalist legitimacy that leads it to contest the statu quo, for instance, in East Asia, and the US that remains the main stabilizing factor in the region. So to put at the same level the refusal to choose between two sides, in my view, puts limitation to that German strategy. I will just pass some part because I don't want to be too long and want to give some more time to questions and answers. So all this in the German's document is very interesting. It's a first for Germany to have that kind of document. But as I said before, China is almost not mentioned, except, as I said, as one of the many nuclear powers in Northeast Asia. But as Philippe said also, Germany is also more conscious of the necessity to demonstrate its awareness of the hard security issue in the region, because as you mentioned, as someone in the question and answer in the chat said that, Germany recently decided to send a frigate, this is a first, to the region, including in the South China Sea, to assert the principle of rule of law at sea. And also to finish on Germany, it focuses a lot on NATO to develop relations with partners around the globe. So now when you look at the defense of the Indo-Pacific strategy published by France in English very recently, it is, of course, much more robust in terms of hard security. And it doesn't shy away from naming China, following the EU 2019 definition of China as a systemic rival, but also as a country that is constantly increasing its military capabilities and lack of transparency in the region. Of course, as Philippe said, why? France has direct sovereign interest in the Indo-Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, but also in the Pacific Ocean. And this is an aside, but the role of China around mining interests, for instance, in New Caledonia, port interest in Tahiti is also something that we must pay attention to. Second easy in the world, and France is making budgetary efforts to keep a military capacity to act far away from its shores, including in the Indo-Pacific. And by the way, since 2016, France has regularly sent ships in the South China Sea. And since the Ministry of Armed Forces went very public about the mission by the French nuclear submarine Emeraude, it started its mission in September last year. The mission is not finished yet, and it went through the South China Sea. And there was a will from the French side to demonstrate to China very clearly that France was there in the region, has a capability to be there, and it was legitimate, and it was a direct response to what you mentioned, that China wants to exclude all other powers from the region. And this is, of course, a big difference with the German posture, because Germany does not have the capability for historical reasons to do that kind of mission. One of the issues will be, of course, for France, and as demonstrated in the differences between the two strategies, France and Germany, will be the debates surrounding a possible potential EU Indo-Pacific strategy, reconciling two divisions that until now remain quite different and not exactly the same. So, to sum up, for France, there are three strategic dimensions in the region: the China-US competition, but with a stress on China threat, even if it's not called a threat all the time; a decline of multilateralism, but this maybe will change with the election of Joe Biden. It was written under Trump. And what is called the shrinking of the geostrategic space, meaning what is going on in the Indo-Pacific cannot be put aside in Europe, even if it's very far away. It has consequences for us too. So in that sense, France has, for historical reasons, also a more realistic vision of the region, as well as capacity and direct interest to engage. So to conclude, just one word on the strategic autonomy concept in relations also with NATO, that very often is not very well understood in Europe, but also in some countries in Europe, but also in Asia, and particularly in Japan. The main issue, like, of course, it's the same in relations between Japan and the US actually, is a necessity to consult, to debate, to define priorities between allies, and the need to have a real dialogue, not a too hierarchical one. And I will give an example, quick one on Japan and the US, and the problems that can also be the ones at the EU level. One example, for instance, is a recent announcement that the US would like to build a kind of deterrent string of missile bases along the first island chain facing China. Japan is part of it. But where, how, what would be Japan's responses? What can Japan do? What the Japanese public opinion would say about that? All these questions need to be debated in depth. It does not mean that Japan and the US are not the closest allies in Asia. So for EU, thinking about strategic autonomy in order to define our interest and priorities is a must. But it doesn't mean that a breakup from being the close US ally. It doesn't mean a breakup from NATO, but saying that post-Soviet, Cold War NATO as issues of definition or redefinition is also a necessity in order to stay relevant. This is also on this basis that a better dialogue, more fruitful and frank, can be built with our like-minded partners in Asia. And of course, among them, Japan is extremely important as a very dominant, not dominant, I mean, very primary maritime power in Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valérie, and thank you very much, Dr. Hosoya. I think we had a very good overview from both the Asian side and the European side, Japan and France, two very important Indo-Pacific countries. I just noticed there's some kind of dichotomy maybe between the perhaps the German view from within Europe on the economy that is really the prime motor of their ambition in the Indo-Pacific, and maybe a more sort of strategic dimension of Indo-Pacific in France. But let me start by asking Yuichi-san if when you talk about the Indo-Pacific not being a containment strategy of China, how is it possible when you have military exercises between India, Australia, the United States, and Japan? I mean, also these Indo-Pacific strategies that we've discussed, that also Valérie alluded to, they don't necessarily mention China, but they mention hegemony. And there's only one country seeking hegemony. Well, perhaps the United States might be put in this picture in Asia Pacific. So it's very hard to avoid this impression that there's one country that is actually, as I think Valérie, you said, the centrality of China. So how do you counterbalance this impression that China is the target, and how do you not isolate it? Just one final word. Valérie, you mentioned the comprehensive agreement on investments between the EU and China. Now, my impression is that there was some outrage in the US and in Europe about this, but in Asia, including in Japan, nobody actually raised an eyebrow, because trade is part of life, and trade between Japan and China is still going on. So there is there's no problem with having on one side a strategic dimension and a trade or investment dimension. We'll see whether this deal actually gets ratified in the end. But I think it's a very important point to make that there's the economy on one side and the military side as well. So would you like to react, Dr. Hosoya? Please.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your very interesting question, important question. First of all, Japan has had more than 1,000 years of political relationship with China. And we suffered a lot, but at the same time, we have imported so many good things, material things, and of course, legal, philosophical, moral, and so on. So we know, I mean, in Asia, Korea, Vietnam, India, I think all of these Asian countries know well that we can benefit hugely from a stable, friendly relationship with China. But at the same time, China often invades surrounding country. If friend China is powerful enough to be able to change the border, China will do it whenever they can. Even though the relationship with the other country is good, they will do it. Like in the South China Sea, since 2002, China has been enjoying quite a friendly relationship with ASEAN countries based upon DOC, Doctrine of Conduct. China could exploit this kind of friendly relationship. Like, let me give you another example. 2008, June 2008, Prime Minister Fukuda Yasuo was really favored Japanese leader in China. And Fukuda concluded important agreement with Chinese government based upon a common strategic interest based upon good political relations. He concluded important agreement with China, but on the other hand, within half a year, China sent a public vessel to the territorial water of Senkaku Islands for the first time. So China could do it because China thought that China was powerful enough to change it by exploiting friendly relationship. So we don't like to be we don't like to see this kind of change of status quo by Chinese military force. But on the other hand, we shouldn't and we can't abandon a friendly cooperative relationship with China. So we are pursuing two different goals. So there is no contradiction in a strategy. Like last year in November, Japanese Prime Minister Suga concluded RCEP with China, a kind of a free trade area agreement with China. But in the same month, Japan hosted quadrilateral foreign ministers conference in Tokyo. Without having a strong power, China actually doesn't respect Japanese position in Asia. That's why, of course, you two are China experts, very best China experts. So that's why you, I think, fully understand these situations. So that's why military exercise is necessary to stabilize the region. We cannot destabilize the region, but without showing a military presence, China will enjoy exploiting such kind of the vacuum of power. That's why I think that European powers should also join in trying to defend the rule-based international order, resisting to China's challenge or adventure to change the status quo by force. This is basically my understanding about the question.
Okay, thank you. There's a question in the chat that maybe, Valérie, did you want to respond to this?
I just wanted to add maybe one point. This is something that Japan and European Union countries, most of them, do share. This is how China is very sometimes eager to sell the idea of decoupling between the economy and strategic issues or security issues. And this is particularly true for Japan. And the most recent example, for instance, is the question of the Senkaku Islands, which has been, I know it's not an issue officially for Japan, but I mean, things happening around the Senkaku Islands for years. But most recently, just when China was trying to win back Japan, stressing the necessity for Japan and China to improve the economic relations, trying to play on the fact that quite a few people in Japan are very eager to build closer relations with China at the economic level. In spite of that, 1 month ago, China adopted a new law giving its Coast Guard forces the capacity to how do you say, to fire with cannon-like arms, in contradiction with basic UNCLOS rules, because it applies for China to territories that it does not control, it has no sovereignty rights on. And China sent a few ships, such armed, since the law has been adopted already in the Senkaku's contiguous and territorial waters. So you see that always at the same time, you have some offers to cooperate better at the economic level, but it never stops China to try to advance its own, push the red lines and try to use force, as Yuichi Hosoya just mentioned, to change the status quo. And this is, I think, related to what are the priorities at the top of the Communist Party in China. And nationalism became, and the capacity for China, for the Communist Party to demonstrate that it is extremely strong and can assert China's power in its region is very much part of its legitimacy process again. And so even if it goes against the interest of China, even if there are so many backlashes, particularly since the COVID-19 crisis against China, still ideology is predominant and rules decisions that can be very counterproductive for the interest of China itself. This is what I wanted to add.
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt we're entering a period actually starting today with the National People's Congress in Beijing, with the 100th anniversary of the CCP in July, the 20th Party Congress next year. we're not going to be soft on nationalism in China. You know, it's going to be a tough two years to digest, to say the least. But can I just go back to this idea? By the way, if people have questions, please feel free to ask them. And I just want to go back briefly to the question of decoupling. Both President Macron and Chancellor Merkel seem to be dead against decoupling, this idea of isolating China economically or in general. And they've expressed this. So I'd like to know from Yuichi-san how Japan perceives this, because again, the agreement I mentioned, which is still in process, wasn't really, didn't bring a lot of reaction to Asians. But on this particular view, which seems to be the EU view, and which comes along in upcoming Indo-Pacific strategy, as Valérie mentioned, I'd like to know how Japan sees its relationship with the EU in that context. And then we'll go back to, they have questions in the chat. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think that this is also a very important question, which we all have to consider carefully. Well, first of all, last year, under the Trump administration, and particularly by Secretary of State Mike Pence, the US government was trying to promote a much more comprehensive decoupling between China and the global economy. And the Japanese approach to the question is much more nuanced, because of course the Japanese investments and Japanese trade relationship with China is much bigger than the United States relationship with China. And the Japanese business companies are much more heavily relying upon Chinese market or trading with China. So that's why we have Asian supply chain, which are closely linked, nearly equal to European version of supply chain. So that's why it's really difficult for us to remove Chinese element from that. But for many years, we didn't actually carefully think about the dangers and the risks of having a very close relationship with China, because in the early 1990s, when Japanese government was really eager to bring China into the WTO, regardless of some of the criticisms and the resistance to that, Japanese government thought that richer China could become much more cooperative, friendly, and peaceful China. We are wrong. Twice we are wrong. And then 2008, we believed in the words which Chinese leaders actually made. But once again, we are betrayed by China. So I think that Japan was a particularly interesting country to look at, because twice Japanese government made a great effort to tie China with global economy, because we thought that it would be better for us to do that. But by doing that, well, Japan is facing China's challenge to take over some of the islands which we have still, of course. And China did it in the South China Sea. And now a lot of vessels, public vessels, are moving from South China Sea to East China Sea to change the status quo. So in that sense, we should maintain, of course, a kind of a supply chain. But we have to be more careful in looking at sensitive technologies, which would help China to become furthermore threatening and furthermore powerful to change the status quo by force. And in that aspect, I think that the current Biden administration's approach is quite balanced by continuing some of the previous decoupling strategy, and at the same time trying to create more cooperation, because it depends on the policy areas. So this is my take.
Thank you very much. So okay, let's move to the questions. First, I think to Valérie, there are two questions on Europe. One of them is asking what is the German China Sea strategy, although I know you're not German, there's no doubt about that. But the question is referring to a Chinese frigate to cross the South China Sea in the summer, which is not confirmed, but which appears likely. And then there's another question which is a little bit wider, but related. What made European countries think it's worth sending ships to the South China Sea? So obviously that includes France, which has been doing it for many years. That includes Germany, as I just mentioned, and that includes the United Kingdom, who has actually a very close relationship with Japan as well. So, so Valérie, would you like to take this one?
Well, yes, I partly answered that question in my presentation concerning Germany, which is that in spite of the fact that the German Indo-Pacific strategy is very prudent, alongside the evolution that we saw at the EU level, there is a consciousness, I don't know if it's the right word, but a realization that China poses certain threat, and as Yuichi Hosoya just mentioned, you need to put some limits, clear limits, even though it's not, of course, the EU, France, Germany, or even the UK, in spite of its good relations with Japan, that will be able to maintain stability in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, and in the South or East China Sea still, to demonstrate to China that not only the US, not only Japan, not only Vietnam or the Philippines or India or Australia do share a position that we must give clear signals to China to show that there are some red lines that cannot be crossed without consequences. And I think that sending ships is a way to reassert or attachment to basic principles. And as I think at that time, Minister Le Drian mentioned, if you put in danger the principle of freedom of navigation at sea, and if you let China do that in the South China Sea or East China Sea, for instance, it means that it could be put in danger anywhere in the world. This is also a question of principle. Plus, last but not the least, as was mentioned also earlier, the Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific region is extremely important in terms of global economic growth, in terms of market, in terms of imports for Europe also. It means that anything happening in the region leading to a risk of conflicts or war or destabilization has immediate consequences for Europe too. This is at the core of this new EU perception of the situation in the region and the importance of the Indo-Pacific, and acting in conjunction with our allies and partners, strategic partners in the region.
Thank you. Okay, our time is running up, but we have a few more minutes, and I'd like to sum up a long question that we've just had in the chat, which is the EU's role as a player in Indo-Pacific. And of course, it may be more a question for Valérie, but I'd like Yuichi-san to discuss on this, in the sense that the reference is on EU values and whether the EU can push its values with dealing with China. And of course, the idea of like-minded countries comes to mind. And also, how can the EU work with the US and the Quad? I mean, the Quad is like a club, you could say. Do you think, Yuichi-san, that the Quad would be open to include some European countries on an ad hoc basis or on a permanent basis? Maybe you could take that part of the question, and then I will ask Valérie to conclude and to sort of open up to the European side of things. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, each power has each role in global politics. So French role or German role and the British roles are different from American role or Japanese role. And basically, we usually assume the EU as a normative power because EU has been particularly eager to try to defend rule-based international order and also try to defend the multilateralism. It's the essence, I think, of the EU, even though it doesn't have a strong military power, unlike the United States or China. So we all have to rely on the United States in its hard power, military power, and its huge economic power, as well as technologies. But at the same time, we have our own roles. I think that the Japan and the EU member states are particularly eager to try to prevent China from violating international agreements or international law. And of course, France and the UK are two leading member countries of the permanent member countries within the Security Council of the United Nations. So both UK and France have particular role in deciding important resolutions within the United Nations. So I think that without the strong support coming from France or Germany or UK or EU, NATO, we are not powerful enough. Of course, we are relying on the goodwill of the United States based on the US-Japan alliance, but I think that we need much more. We need international global voice, but the voice of international community to try to deter China to change the status quo, to violate sovereignties of other countries. Without doing it, we will see the repetition of what China did in the South China Sea. Some of the islands which were occupied previously by the Philippines or Vietnam actually are now under the Chinese control. So China can control the both East China Sea and South China Sea as their lakes, but then they would create quite a safe hegemonic or imperial regional order. I partly understand that because imperial powers, including Japan, invaded China from the sea. That's why China are really sensitive to try to control these seas. But now we are living in the 21st century, not 19th century. That's why we have to defend the rule-based international order together with leading countries of Europe, such as France and Germany and the UK as well.
So the EU has a normative power, but one remembers that the South China Sea decision by the International Arbitration Court of The Hague was not recognized by China, who did not acknowledge this decision. So, and that wasn't the EU, but that was in Europe, in The Hague. So, Valérie, you have, sorry, please, go ahead, yes.
Well, that partly because at that time, both the United States and the EU were not very much keen on interfering in the region. But nowadays, I think that both the EU and the US are much more carefully looking at what's happening in East China Sea. So that situation is getting better, I would say.
Interesting. Thank you. Valérie, just 1 minute to respond to the EU question, and then we'll conclude.
Yes, I think that this is true. EU is a normative power, but it's not only that. And I think in terms of security, including in terms, and this is also the case for France, of capacity buildings with agreement we have with many countries in Southeast Asia, India, Australia, and hopefully Japan too. It's also a very important role that the EU or member states can play in the region. And just to finish, of course, one of the major challenges at the EU level, not member states level, not all of them, is the differences that still exist, even though there have been some progress in this also, between different EU states with different priorities, different interests. Look, for instance, at what is going on now today between Hungary and China, for instance, with around the Chinese vaccine and so on. This is very important because we still do not have a common position regarding China, even though I'm more optimistic, as Yuichi Hosoya just said, than I would have been a few years ago.
Okay, we have just a couple of minutes to conclude, but I just want to read a comment from our friend Frederick Gra, our colleague, who's a great expert on the Indo-Pacific, who said the strategic dimension of international trade is absent from our discussion. Yuichi-san, would you like to say something about
I think
this
we mentioned
topic?
that more or less.
I think so, but he's a perfectionist, so we have to give him credit for that.
We need another webinar to discuss.
We need another hour, basically. But would you like to conclude briefly, Yuichi-san? Would you like to conclude?
No. Oh, you should.
Okay, well, all right. Valérie, would you like to say a few more words, or shall I just...
to say that, of course, everybody knows that the first trade partner of China in Europe is Germany. So the position, and France is not particularly good at external trade. So, of course,
well, no, I mean, perhaps we should also acknowledge the fact there's a free trade agreement between Japan and the EU, a very, very strong one,
true, yes,
as well as with other Asian countries, Vietnam, South Korea, and so on. And with China, we have as I said, an ongoing process of an investment agreement, which may not actually be ratified. So there are a number of deals going on, and at the same time, there's the Indo-Pacific situation, which we've discussed extensively, with a lot of strategic dimensions. So there are really two subjects imbricated. But anyway, our time is up, and I think we could have been going on for another couple of hours without any problem. But I need to thank you very much for very enlightening comments, and I look forward to another discussion on the topic of Indo-Pacific.
Just
Valérie?
to finish, we will have a few other webinars, so check the FRS website and you will see the links. And also, all these webinars will be put on the FRS YouTube chain, so you can watch again or send it to people who would like to watch it but didn't have time to link this time. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
So bye-bye, and thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.